Yeah, I am honored to be here. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with the Niles Coalition. I've been inspired by all of the work that you guys have been doing, and I know the past year has been, an uphill battle for you all. So I really appreciate that. I do see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, but for those who I don't know, I think now would be a good time to launch the poll. Just want to get a sense of who is in the meeting today for people working in libraries or community members. And I think, all right. So, so yeah, I've been really inspired by what the Niles Coalition has been doing, both the library workers and the community that has come together to support and defend the library. So today my goal is kind of to make the case for why neoliberalism is actually the driving force behind this attack, not just on Niles, but on public libraries in general. And I do go into some of that in the paper. This presentation is going to focus a little bit more on defining neoliberalism, because I think that that word gets tossed around a lot. And I don't think it's necessary that people don't know what it means. It's more like there are different ways of understanding what it means. So I'm going to kind of lay out a case for how I would define neoliberalism and then the way that it impacts public libraries. So let's see, share my screen. All right, so I'm actually going to start us off with some memes, like the good millennial that I am. I guess, I don't know if they're technically count as memes or just screenshots of tweets, but the first one says, if they didn't already exist, public libraries would strike people as the most outlandish left-wing idea. And the other one says, my girlfriend regularly tells me if free public libraries didn't already exist and someone tried to invent them, they would be condemned as a socialist plot. And I think about that a lot. So I'm guessing this rings true for most people, but I do think it's more than just like a flippant Twitter, observation. I think it tells us a lot about why libraries are perpetually under attack. So I want to kind of dig into this a little bit more. And this is where, if you guys do want to unmute yourself or put some comments in the chat, but I'm just curious, to kind of dig into these statements a little bit more. What do you think makes the public library a left-wing or a socialist idea, or why would someone think that? Yes, and I see Claire in the chat saying that I think it's because our mission is to share resources and make them available no matter how much money you have. That goes against the idea of working for everything. Any other thoughts on that? Well, I do think both of those are valid points. I will say that what Claire said is more along the lines of what I'm going to go with, since I'm trying to make the case about neoliberalism, right? So I think there's a lot that can be said about sort of the social aspects of libraries and collections and things like that. But I think fundamentally, public libraries are publicly funded. Everything's available for free. It exists for the sake of the public good. It's not there to make a profit for anyone. And so I think that's particularly why it might be deemed socialist. Left-wing, people might have different definitions of what left-wing means, but socialism, generally people think of that as, well, I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole nother conversation about what socialism actually means. But yeah, so that's kind of how I would, so I forgot to click and prompt you with my cool PowerPoint transitions, but you already answered the question. All right. But what exactly is neoliberalism? So to explain it, again, rather than trying to give just a straight up definition, I want to look to the people who first sort of dreamed it up and implemented it. So if you do a Google image search of neoliberalism, which is what I did, this is the first image that comes up. So another question for the audience, do you recognize any of those four people? Yep, Reagan.
The others look vaguely familiar, but I cannot remember who they are.
Yeah, we got Margaret Thatcher on the right and Reagan. Yes. Not surprised. They were the only two that I knew of for most of my life, but I actually did not know much about the first person who we're going to talk about. So his name is Friedrich Hayek, or yeah, I think that's how you pronounce it. He was an Austrian economist and a political theorist, and he was one of 26 attendees at the 1938 Walter Lippmann colloquium colloquium in Paris, and that's actually where the term neoliberalism, as we know it today, was coined. So the goal of this conference was to construct a new liberalism, thus neoliberalism. So classical liberalism had been dominant for over a century across Europe and the United States. But in the wake of the Great Depression, there was an opening for new economic ideas. Now, not everyone at the conference agreed on all of the details of neoliberalism, but ultimately they were against FDR's sort of New Deal, Keynesian economics, basically funding, social programs is what they were definitely all against. And then, World War II, again, FDR and the New Deal were kind of the dominant political ideas of the day. But shortly after World War II in 1947, Hayek then went on to form the Mont Pelerin Society. And this was essentially the first international think tank. So it was an international organization of economists, philosophers, historians, and business leaders. And in its statement of aims, it said, "The central values of civilization are in danger, fostered by a decline of belief in private property and the competitive market." So that's where they were going with this. And the next neoliberal on our list, the next guy, was also a member of this Mont Pelerin Society. His name was Milton Friedman. So as for those of us in Chicago, we should know him. Maybe you've heard of him and you just recognize his face. That was the case for me. I didn't really realize what he looked like. He was born in New York, and he taught economics at the University of Chicago from 1946 to 1977. He was one of the leading thinkers of the Chicago School of Economics. And I think one of the best ways to understand the theories of the Chicago School of Economics is actually to look at how they were implemented in Chile in the 1970s. So I'm going to share this, about 3 minutes of this clip here. All right. Everyone hear it?
Nosotros fuimos el laboratorio neoliberal del mundo.
The protests over inequality in Chile are not spontaneous. If we go back in history, we'll find a dictatorship, a group of economists, and even the CIA. Chile is considered the world's neoliberal laboratory because during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, it was one of the first countries in which Milton Friedman's economic policies were applied. He was the guru of neoliberalism. This earned Chile the title of economic miracle, but not all Chileans are in agreement.
Queremos que cambie este sistema capitalista, un sistema enfermo y que tiene a la gente agonizando.
The keys to this experiment were the Chicago Boys. They were a group of Chilean students awarded scholarships by the United States government between 1957 and 1970 to study postgraduate economics at the University of Chicago, the cradle of neoliberalism. There, they learned from Friedman himself. Neoliberalism is a capitalist political model that believes in the free market. This means that the less the government gets involved with the economy, the better. And so, without the participation of the state, the market can regulate itself. What are the results?
Privatizan todo.
Exactly. But let's go back to the Chicago Boys. Before Pinochet's coup d'etat in 1973, the Chicago Boys wrote El Ladrillo, or the Brick, a document of over 500 pages that detailed a neoliberal economic plan for Chile post-Salvador Allende. The CIA was implicated in the preparation of this plan. After the coup, the military junta used El Ladrillo as its economic guide, and the Chicago Boys actively participated in Pinochet's cabinet. They and their students continued to participate in the political and economic life of Chile in important government positions. During the dictatorship, Pinochet applied neoliberal policies with an iron fist. He sold state enterprises and drastically reduced public spending. In just 1 year, and by force, it was cut 27%. This created a lot of discontent. As a result, inflation reached almost 600% in 1974, and more than 1.5 million Chileans were unemployed. While the majority of the population was becoming more impoverished, the country's elite and foreign companies got rich.
Yo creo que en Chile hay una noción muy clara de que este sistema económico se impuso por las armas durante la dictadura y que de otro modo no se habría podido imponer, porque era muy fuerte para la gente las consecuencias que tenía.
After much recession and inflation, the economy managed to stabilize by 1988. The cost? 45% of the population had fallen below the poverty line. It's said that Chile's economy has grown at a macroeconomic level. That means that companies are doing well, but the people are not seeing this economic boom.
Los Chicago Boys creen que el modelo neoliberal fue exitoso porque nos llevó a tener el Producto Interno Bruto más alto de América Latina.
And that's how we got to the present day.
Okay. Personal anecdote related to Chile. I actually lived in Chile in 2007. I went there and I was teaching English as a volunteer. And when I would tell people that I was from Chicago, their first response was, "Oh, sí, los Chicago boys." And I, being the ignorant gringa that I was I thought they were saying Chicago Bulls. Because I had actually studied abroad in Costa Rica before that, and that's what the response was whenever I told people I was from Chicago in Costa Rica. People just think about Chicago Bulls. They were an international phenomenon in the 90s, but eventually I came to realize that they were talking about Chicago boys and not the boys that played basketball for the Bulls, but these Chicago boys from Milton Friedman. I also got inadvertently caught up in a protest that looked a lot like this picture on the screen here. I couldn't find one from the actual protest that I was involved in, but I shouldn't say involved in. I was like shopping in downtown Santiago. And then all of a sudden there were like these riot cops like dragging students through the streets and like the water cannons and the tear gas and all of that. So it was quite a political education that I got in Chile. And there's a lot of history there if you're interested in learning more about that. So around the same time that Friedman's neoliberalism was showing its effectiveness in Chile, the US and the UK were experiencing economic crises of their own with inflation and stagnating economies. So that brings us to our last two neoliberals, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States from 1981 to 1989, and Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister of the UK from 1979 to 1990. They were both influenced by the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, largely through their association with conservative think tanks. So Reagan was part of the Heritage Foundation, and Margaret Thatcher was part of the Institute on Economic Affairs. Reagan is probably most well known for his theory of trickle-down economics, and I think the best way to explain that is through this Peanuts cartoon. So we've got Lucy holding the football there saying, if you cut taxes on the rich, they'll invest that money and create jobs for everyone. And as we know, Lucy's going to pull that football away before Charlie Brown can kick it. So then we can kind of take a look here at what that actually did. So you can see in the chart here of the top marginal income tax rates, Reagan took office and boom, they plummeted. And what did that do did it trickle down to people? Well, here we go, starting around the time of when Reagan took office, you can see it was pretty, the tax rates were almost, on par, 30, 33, 36. And by 2010, and this is a little bit outdated, but I think it's only gotten worse since then. So obviously trickle down economics is a lie. Margaret Thatcher was probably most well known for her phrase, her slogan, "There is no alternative." It became such a catchphrase for her that people refer to it as TINA. It's like its own abbreviation. And she used this phrase repeatedly in defense of the market economy as a way to proclaim that capitalism is the best, the right, the only system that works. There's no alternative to capitalism. This was basically the message. And she has a lot of really disturbing quotes, but I think this is probably the most disturbing one to me. So she said, "Economics are the method, the object is to change the soul." If that is not chilling, I don't know what is. So I would say that ideological propaganda also really flourished during this time. The 80s are considered like the golden age of neoliberalism due to Reagan and Thatcher. And, it did start with them, but it has been continued by every president of the US for the past 3 decades. And that does include Democrats. So it did, it started as this right-wing conservative ideology, but Democrats definitely embraced it. And I could go through like a history of, how every president sort of supported neoliberalism, but I thought it would be simpler to kind of take the Democrat who most people consider to be the most progressive in recent history and show how he too supported neoliberal policies. So the first one would be the 2009 bank bailouts, using public tax dollars to save private banks and leaving everyday people, out to dry. That's just classic neoliberalism, right? Some people would call it socialism for the rich. And then the Affordable Care Act, this one like really gets under my skin when people call it socialism because it's literally textbook neoliberalism. It was like the foundations of the Affordable Care Act, at least the private marketplace portions of it, were actually designed by the Heritage Foundation, that same neoliberal think tank that Reagan was a part of. And it was used by Mitt Romney. So it was, it's very much, the central feature is it's a private marketplace where people can buy their own healthcare. That you can't get more neoliberal than that. You're funneling, money into private. The government is helping funnel money to private corporations, which is in stark contrast to actual universal healthcare. Like even in the UK, Margaret Thatcher was not able to dismantle the NHS, their national healthcare service. Most quote Western countries have state-funded healthcare. So this Affordable Care Act is literally the opposite of socialism. So why, you might be wondering, like, why are Democrats and Republicans on the same page about neoliberalism? And I would say the reason is that the biggest difference between Democrats and Republicans are probably more in the realm of social attitudes. And again, I'm going to bring up a cartoon because I think cartoons do a really good job of explaining things. So you've got, your Republicans with their bombs, and then you've got your Democrats with their bombs, but Black Lives Matter, Yes You Can, and LGBT rights, right? So essentially, economically, Democrats and Republicans share the same goal of upholding capitalism. And they may have some different ideas about how to best do that, but ultimately, they still do what they think is best for the market. So what does neoliberalism mean for the public library? First and foremost, I think hopefully after the way that I've laid out, what neoliberalism means, the fact that it's a public institution, it's basically antithetical to neoliberalism. So that means we constantly have to justify our existence. And if you work in libraries, you already know that this is true. We're always having to justify our existence. When I was getting my MLIS in 2015, 2016, the phrase demonstrating value always came up. I remember professors telling us that librarians have failed to adequately prove the worth of libraries, and that's why funding has suffered. But this assertion is false. And I kind of go into this more detail in the article that Elizabeth shared earlier. But to kind of give a little overview, the first question I think we have to ask when we hear that is the value of the library really in question? So I'm going to pull up a couple recent Pew survey results, and you can see the first one is a little bit dated. It's from 2013. Oops, no, not Rahm Emanuel yet. The first one is a little bit dated. It's from 2013, but they actually stopped asking that question in future polls. But how important are libraries? You can see that to your community as a whole, that's over 90. Wait, can I do math? Yeah, that's 91% of people think that libraries are either very important or somewhat important. And then the lower one is from 2016, and they asked, do people think that closing their public libraries would hurt communities? And again, that's 91% of people think that it would have either a major or at least a minor impact on their communities. So, it seems pretty clear, and this is just like one sample. I think we could come up with many other examples of the ways in which people are, huge supporters. The public are huge supporters of the library. So is it the politicians then that don't know the value of the public library? And here we have Rahm Emanuel, who was the former mayor of Chicago. He is, in this picture, he's speaking at a press conference talking about the importance of libraries. And he's told the crowd, this is your passport. With the library, our children can travel anywhere. So if you're, watching this press conference, you're like, wow, Rahm Emanuel loves libraries. He understands the value of the public library. So I bet that means that libraries, fared well in his first city budget, right? But you would be wrong. So in 2012, his first city budget, he proposed cutting the library budget by $10 million, laying off 343 library workers, and closing all branches on Mondays. So library is great, but I'm going to slash your budget anyways. If you are making the face that girl on the right is making, then I think that is the correct response. So, what does all this mean? If politicians are slashing budgets while they're singing libraries' praises, it seems pretty clear that just demonstrating value is not going to be enough to stop the cuts. And AFSCME, the union that represents Chicago Public Library workers, they did fight back and they were able to reduce these cuts, but I think the point still remains that it's really the neoliberal ideology of, cutting back on public spending that is so strong that politicians are compelled to put the needs of the market above the needs of the community. So what does neoliberalism look like at the Niles-Maine Public Library? I'm hoping that afterwards, those of you who actually work at Niles or live in Niles can speak to this a little bit more. But I am going to just go over a little bit from what I have gathered from following what's been happening. So in April of 2021, there were 3 spots open on the Niles Library board, and conservative community members organized a slate to essentially take over. They gained the majority on the board. And I think it's also important to put this in the context of this did not only happen at Niles, right? There's actually a growing Trump-inspired movement across the country of, right-wing fanatics infiltrating government bodies of public governing bodies of public institutions to gut them from the inside. So we've seen this at other public libraries, and we've seen this at school boards as well. And this is the right-wing brand of neoliberalism. So not only do they want to dismantle the public sector to prop up the free market, but it also do it with a heavy dose of bigotry. So as an example of that, during his campaign, the now treasurer of the board, Joe Makula, stated, instead of stocking up on books in 7 different languages, if we got people to assimilate and learn English better, I think we would do more good in that area than increasing our inventory of foreign language books. So, obviously, there's a lot of hatred and bigotry that are driving these people too. It's not just economics. And I haven't seen any reports on this, but I'd bet that, money that they are also in support of, this new wave of right-wingers who are campaigning against critical race theory. But still, I think at the heart of these attacks are a neoliberal doctrine. I think the tactic of taking over a library board is aimed primarily at gaining control of the budget in order to slash it and to weaken the library as an institution. And there's another picture of Joe. So, in addition to his bigotry, he does also use neoliberal speak. So these quotes are from, I think it was a statement that he put out regarding the budget that they tried to pass. So he says, our library will continue to service our community as it has for the past 6 decades, but on a path that is more efficient and effective. So here he kind of almost sounds like Rahm Emanuel, right? He's not saying the public library sucks. He supposedly wants it to continue to serve the community, but has to be more quote unquote efficient and effective, right? So what does that mean? It needs to cost less to taxpayers. He also in that same statement said, most patrons can and do serve themselves and need no assistance finding what they want and navigating the library similar to customers at a store. So first of all, that reveals that he knows nothing about what libraries do, right? And I don't need to get into all of that. You all know what we do in the libraries. He clearly doesn't. But I think it's also important to note that sort of cue of similar to customers at a store, right? This reinforcing the neoliberal ideology that tries to get to us to think of ourselves as customers and everything is about the market, right? Trying to change our ideas of what those relationships are like between people. And so aside from the sort of direct, impacts that neoliberalism has in the library, there are also a lot of indirect impacts on us that I wanted to mention. Oops, going too far. Well, that's fine. So cuts to other public library services, cuts to other public and social services, plus the growing income inequality that comes with, these neoliberal tax cuts, lead to libraries as a last social safety net. And I think homelessness is a topic that's talked about a lot in libraries. We can see here, these are, I think, the latest numbers from HUD going into 2020 about how many people in the US are experiencing homelessness. And you can see that it is still and consistently over 500,000 people at any given time in this country are homeless. That impacts libraries in a lot of ways, but of course, the biggest, well, maybe not the biggest, but maybe one of the more obvious is that public libraries are probably the only, or often the only safe, warm, and free place for someone to go who has nowhere else to go. And we could talk a lot more about this, and others have talked about it in more detail, but I did want to point that out. And also, just some of the other things that we help people with on a daily basis, like we're helping people file for unemployment, for food assistance and filing their taxes, and just navigating all of the bureaucracies, particularly for this growing population of people that have unmet needs because of the impacts of neoliberal policies. So, oops, no. So how do we fight back? So if we want to live in a world where the public library is not in a perpetual state of existential crisis, and where we can spend our time helping our communities flourish rather than just trying to save them from drowning, what should we do? So I would say, first and foremost, we need to start thinking collectively and not individually. I think the scariest part of neoliberalism is how effective it's been at convincing us that competition and private property, or private profit and property, are the highest good. It's really ingrained in us, and it takes active unlearning. So, just kind of retrain yourself to think collectively and not individually. Don't think of yourself as just a consumer or a customer. And then once you start thinking collectively, start acting collectively. So, one of the first and obvious ways to do that is in workplace unions. Super inspiring to see Niles unionize in the middle of all of this. And that's a great place to start if your workplace isn't already unionized. Once you're unionized, be sure to stay active. I think another thing that neoliberalism has done, insofar as it has allowed unions to exist at all, is, kind of turning them into these, just another negotiator at the table, right? And so, it's really important to not just see the union as a separate entity that's going to do something for you, but you are the union. And I know, the AFSCME workers, or the union that represents CPL workers, there are people organizing there to kind of, take, I don't want to say take over the union, but kind of changing the leadership and taking a more active role in the union. And the Chicago Teachers Union is a really good example of this. I go into that a little bit more in the article, but unionize and be an active member of the union. Community groups like the Niles Coalition, again, super inspiring, great way to bring people together around this fight, other fights. Once you become a part of it, you can find other like-minded people and see what else is happening in your community. What other ways can we sort of support people who are fighting back against neoliberalism? And then there's also more explicitly political organizations. So I am a socialist. I'm a member of Democratic Socialists of America. If you want to learn more about what socialism actually is, hint, it is not Obamacare, you should check out DSA. There's also other socialist organizations, in the city, and well, maybe not as much in the suburbs, but I know that there is a North suburban branch of DSA as well. And lastly, solidarity. So none of us can win this fight alone. If you want to save the public library, you have to care about the public, about humanity as a whole. And neoliberalism isn't something that we're going to dismantle one public library at a time. We have to connect the fight for the public library with the struggles that everyone else is fighting against oppression and inequality. So show up for the workers who are unionizing at Starbucks and Amazon. Support the healthcare workers who are on the front lines of the pandemic. Just talk to people in your community, find like-minded people, organize with them, and support each other. So I know all of this can feel really overwhelming, and so I want to end on with a quote from Ursula Le Guin that always gives me hope. So she says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And that is it.